Edmure Tully gazed across the courtyard of Riverrun, watching the fresh morning sun cast slanted rays upon the polished stones. The last vestiges of night's mist clung to the battlements, reluctant to leave the sanctuary of cool shadows. He had not slept well these past weeks. His days were consumed with council sessions where lords of the Riverlands besieged him with pleas and warnings, and his nights filled with visions of war-torn fields. Even the hush of dawn offered no solace. A messenger had arrived earlier, bearing an ominous missive from the Lannisters, the red wax stamped with the proud lion's head. Edmure had broken the seal with trembling hands. It began cordially enough, too cordially, he thought, speaking of shared interests and a way to preserve peace in the Riverlands. The letter went on to detail mutual benefits and respect for Tully independence, words that Edmure found suspiciously sweet. Words from the Lannisters were rarely sweet unless they carried a hidden barb. Yet the missive was not entirely a surprise. The chaos of the realm had left no house unscathed. Alliances were shifting like river currents. For weeks, the Tully bannermen had been pressed hard by raiding parties loyal to the Iron Throne, by clans from the mountains that trickled in for a chance at plunder, by House Frey's uncertain stance, and by the intangible worry that House Tully was isolated. They were sworn to the Starks by marriage. Catelyn was Ned's wife after all, but the Stark armies were far to the north, and Ned Stark himself was in the dungeons of King's Landing awaiting trial or worse. Riverrun, proud fortress though it was, felt more alone than ever. There was a rustling near the archway as Ser Desmond Grell emerged, his expression grave. He cleared his throat to announce himself. Edmure turned, one hand still wrapped around the Lannister letter, the other resting on the hilt of his sword. Even now, in the relative peace of Riverrun's courtyard, Edmure felt a soldier's tension, as though an enemy might appear around any corner. "My lord," Ser Desmond said carefully, "Lord Tywin's emissary arrived last night. He's waiting in the solar. Shall I have him shown in, or do you wish to break your fast first?" Edmure paused to consider. His stomach roiled at the thought of food, but appearances were important. "I'll meet him in the solar." He slid the parchment into the pocket of his doublet. "Best not to keep Tywin Lannister's man waiting too long. Shall I accompany you?" Ser Desmond offered. Edmure considered. Desmond Grell was a loyal retainer, a seasoned knight who had stood beside Hoster Tully for years. He carried the memory of Edmure's father in his heart and would defend Edmure's honor with his life. Yet for this meeting, perhaps the presence of too many Tully retainers would feel like an implied threat. It might raise Lannister hackles. The precarious nature of these negotiations required caution and subtlety. "No," said Edmure, noticing the faint disappointment in Ser Desmond's eyes. "I'll speak with him alone. Go and see to the men. Make sure the watch is doubled along the walls." He offered a reassuring nod. "Just a precaution. We have no reason to believe the Lannisters would attempt anything unexpected inside our own walls, but I won't be caught unawares." Ser Desmond bowed and left. Edmure pressed a hand to his temple, trying to calm the ache that lived there permanently these days, then made his way through Riverrun's winding corridors. At intervals he would stop to return a soldier's salute or exchange quick words with a passing servant, all the while aware of the letter's weight in his pocket. He stepped into the solar, where the morning light spilled through tall windows. A tall man in a fine burgundy doublet stood near the tapestry that depicted the history of House Tully. He turned immediately upon Edmure's entrance. He was not a knight, judging by his lack of spurs, more likely a high-born messenger, perhaps distantly related to House Lannister. "My Lord Tully," the man said, bowing smoothly. "I am Alistair Hill, in service to Lord Tywin Lannister. I thank you for agreeing to see me." Edmure nodded curtly. The dryness in his mouth grew more pronounced. He reached for the pitcher on the table, pouring himself a cup of watered wine, trying to mask his unease with an air of hospitality. "My father would never have turned a guest from our halls, no matter his creed or cause. House Tully remains ever mindful of courtesy. Will you drink?" Alistair dipped his head in a graceful acknowledgement. "A small cup, my lord, if it pleases you." Edmure poured one for him as well, scrutinizing the man's expression. Allister had a smooth, practiced face that revealed little. He offered Edmure a polite smile, accepted the cup, and drank. There was no sign of hesitation. Either he trusted the Tullys not to poison him, or he was skilled at concealing his fears. Quite possibly both. "Lord Tywin," Allister began, setting his cup aside on the table, "extends his warm greetings and hopes you will consider the terms he put forth in his letter." Edmure's jaw twitched. He had read the letter 3 times. The gist was simple enough. House Tully would declare neutrality in the conflict, refuse to muster for the northern cause, and in return, Tywin Lannister would pledge safety for the Riverlands from further Lannister aggression. More than that, Tywin offered Edmure a seat on the small council in King's Landing once hostilities ceased. There were additional provisions about taxes, about trade routes, about recognition of Tully authority. But in essence, Tywin was offering not only to spare the Riverlands from further depredations, he was promising them a share of power if they turned their backs on the Starks. It made Edmure's conscience twist. Catelyn was married to Ned Stark. How could he simply abandon his sister's new family? Then again, the realm was already fractured. The Starks in the north were raising their banners for war, Robb Stark had marched south, and now Ned Stark was to be judged as a traitor in King's Landing. The Riverlands were on a precipice. They had already endured so many raids that the common folk were near starving. Edmure found himself thinking of the hundreds of peasants who had fled to Riverrun, seeking refuge in the castle's courtyard. They were so frightened, so desperate. Winter was coming, after all, no matter whose sigil flew over the capital. Allister cleared his throat gently. "Lord Tywin recognizes the ancient honor of your house, my lord. He has no wish to see these fair lands laid waste. Indeed, the realm needs the Riverlands to remain prosperous. As he wrote, your father is gravely ill, and with you now at the helm, this can be your moment to solidify House Tully's place in the next age of Westerosi history. An alliance of cooperation, not subjugation." Edmure almost snorted at the word cooperation. But he contained himself. Lannisters had a knack for twisting words into something more palatable than the truth. The Riverlands had never had peace under Lannister boots. Still, Tywin was known for a cold, calculating approach. If he was now offering an olive branch, it had to be because it suited his grand design. He steeled himself. "My father's condition is indeed dire," he said quietly. "But he is still Lord of Riverrun. His mind may falter, but his heart remains with the traditions of our forebears. House Tully has always honored loyalty, and we are not oath-breakers. Nor would we ask you to break your oath, my lord," Allister said, his smile unwavering. "Your oath is to the Iron Throne, is it not? The Tullys became wards of the king in the era of Aegon's conquest, long before any of us now living drew breath. Lord Tywin is but the king's hand. By standing with the lawful king, you would be upholding your ancient vows to the crown." Edmure's eyes narrowed. That was the crux of the matter. Did House Tully owe fealty to King Joffrey, the boy Lannister on the throne, or to the Stark cause, for which his sister's husband had risked so much? The letter's cunning phrasing had already planted these seeds of doubt in him. Edmure sighed and turned to a window, letting his gaze travel over the trident, sparkling under the morning sun. "Why now?" he asked. "Why does Lord Tywin reach out to House Tully instead of pressing his advantage on the field? We have all heard the reports. He has a formidable army, fresh from victory in the south. Why does he not simply march on Riverrun and demand our surrender?" Allister's pause was telling. For a moment, his composure flickered. "War is costly, my lord, in blood, in gold, and in alliances. Lord Tywin is not a man who delights in unnecessary carnage. He prefers that the realm remain as intact as possible for when the conflict ends. If Riverrun were to stand against him, he would be forced to use harsh measures. Neither side wishes to see that come to pass. Consider the boon, my lord. Keep your lands, your titles, and your inheritance intact, and you will preserve your small folk from ruin. The Lannisters will depart, and the Riverlands will remain unravaged by the horrors of war." Edmure's breath caught. It was also reasonable when framed that way. A pang of guilt ran through him. His father would have balked at the suggestion of yielding to the Lannisters. Catelyn would be horrified at the idea of Tully arms turned away from the Stark cause. Robb, the young wolf, was mustering men in the north, likely expecting the Riverlands to rise in full support. But the Riverlands had already been battered by Gregor Clegane's raids. They were ill-prepared for a prolonged, punishing war. He met Alistair's eyes. "Your words are persuasive, but it is a heavy decision. House Tully stands at a crossroads. The choice we make might save thousands, or it might doom our honor." Alistair bowed his head again. "Lord Tywin understands the burdens of leadership. He has also granted me the authority to speak with you of possible, shall we say, sweeter assurances. My Lord Tully, does your house not deserve a seat among those who advise the king? If the traitor Ned Stark has forfeited his position as Hand, and if Joffrey remains upon the Iron Throne, there will be places of influence to fill. The Lannisters are prepared to acknowledge the Tullys as worthy partners in the governance of the realm." Edmure's heart hammered. A seat on the small council for a Tully lord, recognition from the crown, an end to the raids, a chance to preserve the harvest. Perhaps, just perhaps, an opportunity to ensure Catelyn's safety as well, if indeed Ned Stark was declared a traitor. If House Tully aligned with the crown, then Catelyn would have less reason to fear for her life. But would that mean turning his back on Robb? He forced himself not to commit to anything. "I will think on this, Alistair Hill. Return to your master, convey my respects, and know that I shall weigh his words with the gravity they deserve." Alistair opened his mouth as if to press further, but some shred of politeness kept him silent. He offered a final bow, and Edmure had him escorted out of the castle. Once alone, Edmure sank into a chair and exhaled. The day was barely begun, and already he felt the weight of the entire realm on his shoulders. That same afternoon, after ensuring Alistair's departure, Edmure summoned the older knights and counselors loyal to House Tully. They gathered in a smaller hall, lit by tall windows that let in the pale sky's light. The hush in the room reflected their collective unease. Ser Desmond Grell stood to Edmure's left, while Otherides Wayne, steward of Riverrun, positioned himself at the far end of the table, the better to observe everyone's manner. The other figures, lords and knights from surrounding lands, shifted anxiously on their benches. Edmure recounted Alistair Hill's visit in detail. Murmurs rippled through the assembled men. Some faces stiffened in anger at the suggestion of siding with the Lannisters. A few, though, showed signs of guarded relief. Lord Carol Vance, a heavy-set man with streaks of gray in his hair, spoke first. "So the Lannisters are offering to spare the Riverlands in exchange for our allegiance?" He shook his head. "And in the same breath they name Lord Eddard a traitor. He's kin to you, Lord Edmure, and to us by alliance. It feels monstrous to betray him, monstrous to stand with those who had a hand in his imprisonment." Ser Desmond Grell was quick to nod agreement. "Indeed, and we cannot forget what was done to the Riverlands already. Gregor Clegane's men burned and pillaged our villages in the name of the Lannisters. That is blood that cannot be so easily swept aside. We may have the chance to avenge those we lost." Across the table, however, Lord Jonos Bracken cleared his throat. He had never concealed his disdain for the Tullys' closeness to the Starks, especially not since Riverrun's resources had been stretched thin by refugees. He was a proud man, with a perpetual frown etched into his brow. Avenge them how, Ser Desmond? By continuing a war that might see our entire countryside burned? By throwing what remains of our knights against a host that outnumbers us 3-1? The young wolf is an untested boy. If the Tullys wage war beside him, do we trust his leadership not to bring the full wrath of Tywin Lannister upon us? We all know what happened at Harrenhal long ago. Lord Tywin can be savage. A hush fell. Harrenhal, once the mightiest castle in the realm, had been left a ruin by Dragonfire centuries ago. But in recent times, it also served as an object lesson. House Lannister had seized it after butchering the remnants of House Tarbeck and House Rayne. The Rains of Castamere was more than a song. It was a threat, and none could deny that Tywin Lannister was known for making that threat real. "It is true that war could destroy us," said Edmure. But what would we be if we forsake our allies in the north? Lord Hoster Tully made common cause with Lord Eddard Stark to end the Mad King's reign. Our families have been bound by bonds of marriage and mutual respect. Would we throw it all away? Would we accept the protection of a man who has already unleashed horror upon our people? Silence ensued. Then came the carefully measured voice of Otheride's Wayne, the steward. My lord, might we not consider a more delicate solution? If you can negotiate better terms for us, if you can guarantee the Lannisters spare our small folk, perhaps we can remain neutral rather than wholly betray the Starks. Neutral? Ser Desmond muttered bitterly. Is that truly possible with armies on both sides? One side or the other will claim betrayal. If we refuse to muster for the Starks, we have effectively helped the Lannisters. Lord Carol Vance nodded his agreement, though his expression was torn. There's no easy path, my lord. You will not please everyone. The question is one of survival, Lord Jonos Bracken pressed, almost too eagerly. And the best way to secure it. Tywin Lannister is nothing if not a man who keeps his word, provided it's to his advantage. If he pledged to protect us, he would. He is not foolish enough to want the Riverlands in ashes for no gain. We can remain lords of our lands, keep our people alive, and ensure that when the dust settles, House Tully stands. Edmure felt the heaviness in the room. Every pair of eyes was on him. In that moment, he missed his father desperately. Even half-lucid in his sickbed, Hoster Tully had the weight of decades behind him, the moral authority to guide them. But now that duty fell to Edmure. If he made the wrong choice, House Tully might well be torn from root to branch. He dismissed his council with no firm resolution. He needed time. Edmure retreated to the castle's highest ramparts, leaning over the parapets to watch the slow bend of the Red Fork. A gentle breeze ruffled his auburn hair. He tried to recall the simpler days when the fish would leap at dawn, and he and Catelyn would run along the moat, chasing after breezes. The memory felt impossibly distant. Night brought no clarity, only fitful dreams. He dreamt of the great September of Baelor, of Ned Stark kneeling before a jeering crowd, of steel descending. He dreamt of Robb, the young wolf, leading a host across the Twins, calling out for Tully's support, only to have the gates of Riverrun barred against him. He dreamt of Tywin Lannister in gleaming plate, standing over him in victory, though oddly Tywin's face bore the features of a lion carved from stone. When Edmure woke, sweat-drenched, he could not help but sense some omen in it all. Dawn found him at his father's bedside. Hoster Tully's labored breathing filled the chamber, along with the faint stench of sickness. Maester Vyman stood by, checking pulses and mixing potions. When Edmure gently touched his father's brow, he felt the fever that had ravaged Hoster for months. "Father," he murmured, uncertain if the old lord could hear him. "What would you do?" Hoster Tully's eyes fluttered open, but the gaze was cloudy. It was hard to say if he recognized his son. His mouth moved, forming words that might have been tansy or forgive, or perhaps were nothing but delirium. Edmure squeezed his father's hand, tears threatening to spill. In these dire times, he had no guidance. His father might not be able to speak clearly, but somewhere behind those eyes was the man who had taught him about duty. Edmure wished he could conjure that voice in his head to reassure him. Late that morning, another letter arrived from Alistair Hill, or more precisely from Tywin Lannister. The missive was short, reminding Edmure that a decision was expected soon. The Lannisters would not wait forever. If a Tully-Lannister alliance was to be forged, it must be done before the northern armies advanced further south. Delay, Tywin implied, would force him to treat the Riverlands as an enemy territory. Edmure knew time was running short. The tension was so thick he could feel it straining the air. He pictured the toll that a protracted war would take on his fields and villages, the heartbreak of seeing more Tully banners burnt and more people fleeing for their lives. He pictured the scorn of his sister and the contempt of the northern lords if he chose to side with the Lannisters. Yet the realm was no longer a place of easy loyalties. With King Robert dead and Ned Stark in chains, the future was uncertain. Too many lives hinged on his next move. Each argument repeated itself over and over in his mind. Save the Riverlands or uphold the oath to the Starks. Protect thousands of small folk or cling to honor and risk their ruin. The question pounded in his skull. On the third day after Alistair Hill's visit, Edmure awoke with a solemn resolution in his heart. He summoned Ser Desmond Grell and Otherides Wayne at once. They arrived with bleary eyes, but the seriousness in Edmure's voice banished any hint of complaint. "I have made my decision," Edmure said in a low voice, standing by the hearth in his solar. The fire crackled, a small defiance against the chill of morning. "Though my heart struggles against it, I believe that we cannot stand against the might of House Lannister without condemning our people to slaughter. The Starks are far away, and Father is dying. I must preserve what remains of my house." Desmond's face fell. "My lord, you mean?" Edmure closed his eyes briefly. "I will meet with Tywin Lannister's envoys. We will come to terms, provided we secure certain guarantees. The Riverlands must be spared, and we will not turn our swords on the north. At most, we will remain neutral, but we shall pay fealty to King Joffrey." Otherides nodded slowly. "It is a wise course for the survival of House Tully. If the Lannisters can be trusted." Desmond looked pained. "This will be seen as a betrayal by the Starks. Lady Catelyn, your sister, will be devastated." Edmure's heart clenched. "I know, but she is in King's Landing at the moment, or so we hear. I can only pray that by aligning with the crown, we can ensure her better treatment. Perhaps we can even intervene on behalf of Lord Eddard. Tywin Lannister desires our cooperation. We may have leverage to save Ned Stark from an unjust fate." His words sounded uncertain, even to himself, but it was something. A thin sliver of hope. Perhaps an alliance would give the Tullys a seat at the table, the power to negotiate. Perhaps. Without further delay, Edmure penned his reply, sealing it with the Tully trout. It felt like the final thump of a coffin lid. The letter was dispatched by fast rider, and Edmure waited in excruciating suspense. 2 days later, Tywin Lannister's acceptance arrived. He would come to the Riverlands in person, to negotiate final terms at a location deemed suitable by both sides. The knowledge that Tywin Lannister himself was riding toward them made the entire castle buzz with a mixture of dread and curiosity. What manner of man would he be, face to face? The story said he had once held his infant son Tyrion under the sea for a count of 10 to test if the child would survive. Others called him the wealthiest lord in Westeros, the cunning mind behind the throne, the cold father who demanded perfection. Whatever the truth, he was a man of formidable reputation, and now Edmure was preparing to strike a bargain with him. The chosen site was an ancient inn near the Red Fork, halfway between Riverrun and the nearest Lannister-held territory. It was once a bustling travel stop for merchants heading north and west, but the war had driven trade to a near standstill, leaving the inn deserted. Edmure mustered a small retinue, a few Tully knights, some guards for protection, and Maester Vyman. The Lannisters arrived with a regiment of mounted spearmen, their crimson and gold banners flapping. Edmure tried not to be intimidated by their numbers, but it was difficult. When Tywin Lannister dismounted, he cut an imposing figure. His golden hair was streaked heavily with silver. His face was gaunt, his eyes a bright, cold green. He wore a breastplate over a fine black doublet embroidered with gold lions. Behind him, Kevan Lannister, his loyal brother, dismounted as well, along with Tyrion Lannister, the imp, who eyed the inn with a sardonic twist of his lips. A handful of highborn knights completed their party. Edmure advanced, hand resting lightly on his sword, though he prayed there would be no violence. He bowed stiffly to Tywin, who inclined his head in acknowledgement. The moment felt surreal. Here stood the mortal enemy of House Tully, the man whose outriders had terrorized the countryside, now come to treat with them as prospective allies. They moved inside, the common room cleared of all furniture except a long table. Torchlight flickered on the walls, turning Tywin's eyes into shards of green ice. They took their seats on opposite sides. On Edmure's left sat Ser Desmond, on his right, Maester Vyman. Kevan Lannister settled to Tywin's right, Tyrion to his left. The horses and soldiers waited outside in tense formation. Tywin's tone was clipped, businesslike. "Lord Edmure Tully, you have chosen a more sensible path than those who would follow the false king in the north." Edmure bristled at the insult to Robb, but he swallowed his pride. "I am loyal to the Iron Throne, Lord Tywin, so long as the rightful king respects the ancient rights of my house." Tyrion snorted softly, but Tywin ignored him. He took a parchment from within his doublet and placed it on the table. "We have drawn up initial terms. Let us proceed." Edmure listened carefully as Tywin outlined them. In essence, House Tully would publicly proclaim fealty to King Joffrey, acknowledging him as the sole and rightful king of the Seven Kingdoms. House Tully would permit Lannister forces safe passage through the Riverlands as needed, though not forcibly quartering them in Tully seats unless necessary for the king's business. The Riverlands would pay taxes to the crown at a slightly increased rate for 3 years to help recoup the costs of the war. In return, Tywin pledged to halt any further raids on Tully lands, to protect them against any rebel incursion, namely the Northmen under Robb Stark, and to recommend Edmure Tully for a place on the small council once King Joffrey's position was secure. Moreover, Tywin offered to free any Tully prisoners captured during the conflict so far. There were a few knights and men-at-arms taken in skirmishes, and to bestow a certain measure of autonomy on the Riverlands, so that no Lannister troops would remain in permanent garrisons after the war. Edmure fought to keep his face neutral. The terms were not as bad as he had feared, though the mention of an increased tax grated. The big question was whether Tywin would truly keep the Riverlands safe if the North marched south. Tyrion Lannister watched him with penetrating eyes, as if measuring every shift in Edmure's expression. Kevan Lannister seemed impassive, confident that Tywin's presence alone would secure what they wanted. Edmure cleared his throat. "I have 2 conditions, Lord Tywin. First, House Tully will not ride in arms against House Stark. We will remain neutral if you move to subdue them, but I will not personally lead men to slay my own sister's kin. I trust you understand the delicacy of that matter." Tywin's gaze was unreadable. "I do. I can accept that, provided you do not offer them any assistance either." "Agreed," Edmure said softly. He could almost sense Desmond Grell's discomfort beside him. "Second, I want Lord Eddard Stark spared if and when he is found guilty of treason. Should the king wish to execute him, I would ask the crown to show mercy." Tywin's eyes flickered with something like mild irritation. "You would not have the crown's justice carried out?" Edmure forced himself to meet those cold green eyes. "Ned Stark is my sister's husband, the father of her children. His death would serve little purpose and might incite further unrest in the north. Better to hold him as a hostage or exile him to the wall. I ask as a gesture of goodwill." There was a pause. Tyrion's mouth curved in what might have been a ghost of admiration for Edmure's boldness. Kevan Lannister looked to Tywin, clearly waiting for his brother's verdict. Finally, Tywin inclined his head. "If Ned Stark is not already executed by the time these arrangements are formalized, I will do what I can to influence the king. But Joffrey is the final arbiter of justice. You must understand that." Tywin's words were carefully chosen. He offered no outright guarantee, only a promise to do what he could. Yet that might be better than nothing. If Tywin wanted the Riverlands' cooperation, perhaps he would at least try to stay Joffrey's hand. "Very well," Edmure said, his voice steady. "Then I accept your terms on behalf of House Tully and the Riverlords gathered under our banner. The Riverlands will stand with the king, or, if you prefer, remain officially loyal to the Iron Throne, so long as the realm acknowledges our sovereignty over our own domain and does not demand that we spill the blood of our northern kin." Tywin did not smile, but there was a faint satisfaction in his voice. "Then we have an accord. Kevan, draw up a formal treaty for Lord Edmure to sign." So it was done. The sigils of the trout and the lion were put to parchment. Edmure felt a strange hollowness wash over him. He told himself it was relief that the Riverlands would be safe from further devastation. The war might still rage, but Riverrun would be spared direct assault if Tywin kept his word. Yet as he glanced at Ser Desmond, the old knight's expression betrayed the turmoil Edmure himself felt. They had, in effect, chosen to cast aside the bond with the North, at least for the present. That was the price Tywin demanded. Within days, word spread throughout the Riverlands. The news was met with a chorus of mixed reactions. Some, especially among the common folk who had suffered Gregor Clegane's raids, were furious at the notion of bending to the Lannisters. Others breathed a sigh of relief that at least the killing might stop. A handful of lords, like Jonos Bracken, were smugly satisfied, while others, like Carol Vance, seemed ashamed and sorrowful. Far to the north, the news would not be well received, Edmure knew. Robb Stark had summoned the Riverlords to join his campaign to free Ned Stark. Those in the Riverlands who still viewed the Tully name with respect would feel betrayed by Edmure's pact with the Lannisters. But Edmure tried to console himself that neutrality was not quite betrayal. He had not promised to take up arms against the North. That would have been too monstrous to countenance. He only prayed that Robb could see it as such and not seek vengeance upon the Riverlands at a later date. In the weeks that followed, Tywin Lannister ordered his bannermen to cease all raiding in the Riverlands. The Lannister forces camped in certain regions but paid for what supplies they took, in accordance with the new treaty. Hostages from both sides were exchanged. Edmure sent a few young pages of lesser houses to King's Landing as wards, while Tywin allowed the Tully prisoners of war to return home. An uneasy peace settled over the Riverlands, though it was a peace steeped in tension. Edmure found himself beset by resentful lords who denounced this arrangement. He spent endless hours in heated arguments, explaining that the alternative was open warfare on Tully lands, with no certain aid from the north. Then came the letter from King's Landing. Lord Eddard Stark had been executed by King Joffrey after all, ignoring any counsel of mercy. Edmure was summoned to the yard when a courier arrived with the news, a single parchment stained with dust from the roads. Edmure read it twice, the words blurring. He felt a wave of nausea churn in his gut. Ned Stark was dead, executed. The letter offered no details except that he had confessed to treason before the Great September of Baelor, and King Joffrey had pronounced his sentence. No mention was made of Tywin's attempts to intervene. In a sick daze, Edmure read the final line, which stated that the Starks had forfeited all claims to the Riverlands' loyalty by their treachery. A surge of grief and fury roiled within him. He clenched his jaw, tears burning in his eyes as he thought of Catelyn, a widow now, and poor Robb fatherless. All hopes that Tywin would show mercy or stay the king's hand had come to naught. They had parted from the north, and yet still Ned Stark was gone. That night, Edmure drank himself to a bleary half-sleep. He sat in the solar with a cup of strong wine, remembering the last time he'd seen Ned Stark. At the wedding years ago, or was it the funeral of Brandon Stark? The memory was unclear. Whichever it was, Ned had spoken to Edmure politely, had offered to help him with the bow in an archery contest. That quiet courtesy was overshadowed now by the image of a man kneeling before a monstrous boy king. Edmure cursed King Joffrey's name, cursed his own weakness, cursed Tywin's empty words. Was this the price of the alliance? Maester Vyman found him half-conscious by the embers of the fire, a half-empty flagon of wine at his elbow. The maester gently roused him. "My lord, your father calls for you," he said softly. Edmure blinked, groggy. "My father? Is he speaking?" "He is lucid for the moment. I think it best you come quickly." That chased the haze from Edmure's mind more effectively than a bucket of cold water. He followed the maester up the winding steps to Hoster's chamber. There, by the dim light of a single candle, he saw his father's eyes open. Hoster looked frail as a wraith, his skin clinging to bone, but there was an alertness in his gaze Edmure had not seen for many months. Edmure, Hoster rasped. His voice was weak but urgent. "Come closer," he coughed, chest rattling. Edmure knelt by the bedside, taking his father's hand in both of his own. "I'm here, father," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Hoster's eyes flickered over Edmure's face, as if searching for something. "The Riverlands, you must protect," he coughed again, wincing in pain. "Cat, your sister, have you aided her husband's cause?" Edmure swallowed hard, tears threatening again. he faltered, unsure how to explain what he had done. But the fleeting spark of clarity in Hoster's eyes pinned him. He could not lie. "I negotiated peace with the Lannisters," Edmure whispered, each word a dagger to his heart. I thought it would save our people." Hoster's brows drew together. His breathing quickened. "Kat's husband, Ned, he was—" Another cough racked him. Edmure tried to brace him, but the old lord continued in a rattling whisper. "Executed. I heard the maester speak. A travesty." He struggled to say something more, but the words caught in his throat. "I never wanted it," Edmure pleaded, holding back sobs. "I tried to have Tywin intervene to spare him, but Joffrey. Father, I had no choice." Hoster's eyes glistened with tears, or perhaps it was the candlelight. He squeezed Edmure's hand with surprising strength. "You always have a choice, but you must do what you must for the Riverlands. Duty, family, honor." He closed his eyes a moment, breath shuddering. Then his gaze found Edmure again. "Remember those words, Tully words." "I will, father," Edmure vowed, pressing his forehead to Hoster's knuckles. "I promise I will. Please rest. I'm sorry for everything." Hoster gave the faintest nod, then exhaled, and his breath rattled once more. "Cat, find her. Protect her." His eyes drifted shut, but he was still breathing. The moment of clarity passed, leaving Edmure kneeling there in silent agony. Hours later, Hoster slipped back into delirium, and Edmure was left alone, consumed by guilt and sorrow. He had done what he believed necessary to spare the Riverlands from ruin, but in that moment, it felt as if he had sacrificed everything else. The bond with the Starks, his own sense of honor, and the possibility of saving Ned from the king's cruelty. He laid his head on the bed beside his father, too tired even to weep. When the news spread that Ned Stark had been executed, the Riverlands shuddered with new tension. Many houses quietly questioned if they had made the right decision following Edmure's lead. Others hardened in their stance, claiming it was better to have allied with the king now that the Starks had proven powerless to defend even their lord. But talk of the North's vengeance began to drift southward, carried by traveling merchants. Word said that Robb Stark had been proclaimed king in the north, that the Karstarks and the Umbers and other northern houses were rallying under his banner. Worse, rumors whispered that Robb was marching south and had already won a victory or two against the Lannisters near Riverrun's borders. Edmure was confused by these rumors. In theory, the Lannisters should have been able to move freely through the Riverlands now, but he was receiving conflicting reports of skirmishes in the hills, of outriders ambushed by men swearing allegiance to the young wolf. It occurred to him that his treaty with Tywin guaranteed Lannister forces safe passage, but the Northmen might still engage them if they encountered them. The Riverlands were now a stage upon which two armies, Lannister and Stark, might clash, while House Tully was forced to stand aside. It was a bitter pill. To forestall open conflict, Tywin dispatched a messenger to Edmure. He wanted Tully men to help him secure the major roads, to weed out Stark sympathizers and brigands. Edmure refused to put Tully arms in direct conflict with the North. That had been part of the agreement. Furious, Tywin wrote again, accusing Edmure of failing to uphold the spirit of their alliance. Edmure wrote back, pointing out that the terms specifically said House Tully was not required to fight the Starks. Neither side was satisfied with the other's answer, and an uneasy rift formed. In the midst of this growing tension, Walder Frey of the twins made his own move. The old lord had long played both sides, favoring whichever side offered him advantage. Now, seeing that the Tullys had allied with the Lannisters, and the North remained a fearsome rising power, Walder Frey weighed his options. He had initially granted Robb Stark passage across the twins in exchange for a betrothal arrangement, but with Ned Stark dead and Catelyn's influence diminished, Walder Frey began sending polite inquiries to Riverrun. He hinted that, with Edmure Tully's new allegiance to the crown, perhaps House Frey could find a more profitable match or some other arrangement to secure the Frey's advantage. Edmure detested the Freys. He never trusted Walder's slippery manner. But if an alliance with the twins meant controlling the crossing, it might keep both the Lannisters and the Starks from making the Riverlands a battleground. Maybe it was wise to secure the Freys as vassals, though Edmure suspected Walder Frey would never truly be loyal to anyone but himself. Still, Edmure contemplated the possibility. If the Freys joined his cause wholeheartedly, then perhaps the Riverlands would not be so helpless, even while proclaiming fealty to King Joffrey. They could guard their borders against the northern host. They could minimize direct conflict by refusing to let either side pass freely. But that was a dangerous dance. Tywin Lannister expected free passage for his armies. If the Tullys barred them, it would be open defiance of their new treaty. As Edmure wrestled with these dilemmas, Robb Stark struck his first major blow. Word reached Riverrun that the young wolf had smashed a portion of the Lannister army near Oxcross, employing cunning tactics that caught the Lion's men unawares. Hundreds of Lannister soldiers were killed or captured. Tywin himself was not present there. He was in Harrenhal, or so the rumors said, but the blow to Lannister prestige was severe. Suddenly the name Young Wolf was on every tongue, whispered in wonder. The Northmen had proven far from helpless. The news sent a tremor through the newly minted Tully Lannister alliance. If the Starks were strong and enraged, how soon before they turned their swords upon the Riverlands for what they perceived as betrayal? Edmure feared the worst. He received a short letter, carried by a scout from Robb's army. It was addressed to Lord Edmure Tully, and bore the seal of the direwolf. He read it in the privacy of his solar, trembling. "Uncle, I know what you have done. You have signed a pact with Tywin Lannister, the same man who held a sword to our people's throats. You claim neutrality, but your actions have given our enemies free rein in the Riverlands. This is not the loyalty my grandfather once offered to my father when he first came south to fight for the realm's justice. I must do what I must to avenge my father's murder and to secure the North. If you are wise, you will stand aside and not hinder me. There will be no mercy for those who align with the Lannisters to spill northern blood." Robb, king in the North Edmure, sank onto a bench, the letter fluttering in his hand like a dying bird. He could almost hear Robb's voice, young yet hardened by grief. He pictured Kat's tear-streaked face upon learning Ned's fate. He felt sick with the realization that he stood between the Lannisters and the North. By swearing fealty to the crown, Edmure had, in Robb's eyes, forsaken family in favor of realpolitik. Was it not an echo of what Hoster had told him, that they must remember the words family, duty, honor? Edmure had chosen duty in a twisted sense, securing the Riverlands from destruction, but he had sidelined family. Honor? That was another question entirely. He wrote a reply, but it was clumsy and filled with justification. He wanted to say, "I had to do it, I had no choice," but he knew that phrase rang hollow. In the end, he sealed it, uncertain if it would ever reach Robb, or if Robb would care to read it. Battle reports continued to filter in. The Northmen were harassing Lannister supply lines, capturing small groups of men, burning Lannister foraging camps. Tywin Lannister wrote to Riverrun demanding that Edmure keep the roads safe. Edmure wrote back refusing to shed Tully blood for Lannister supply caravans. Their alliance grew more acrimonious by the day. But Tywin remained loath to fully break with Edmure, as the Riverlands' neutrality still kept them from actively supporting Robb. Precarious stalemate emerged. The small folk of the Riverlands, meanwhile, saw Lannister men in their fields, saw northern outriders skirmishing near the woods, and prayed for deliverance. Some parted with harvest grains willingly, hoping to appease whichever army demanded supplies that day. Others hid their daughters and their livestock, fearing the worst from both sides. Refugees once more trickled to Riverrun, though not as many as before. Perhaps they did not trust Edmure's neutrality, or perhaps they were too frightened to travel. He tried to organize relief, but the realm's chaos made it nearly impossible. The heavier taxes demanded by the crown also eroded the resources Edmure could muster to help his own people. With every passing day, Edmure grew more troubled. He would walk the ramparts at sunset, listening to the hush of the waters, wishing the swirling currents could wash away his regret. He had tried to save the Riverlands by allying with the Lannisters, only to see the conflict intensify. Ned Stark was dead. Robb was furious. Tywin was furious. and Riverlands stood in the middle, revered by neither side, a fortress of uncertain loyalty. Another blow fell. Hoster Tully's health declined precipitously. Maester Vyman approached Edmure one evening to say, in a voice tight with sadness, that the old lord would not last the night. Edmure hurried to his father's chamber, found him barely conscious, breath coming in shallow rasps. He took Hoster's hand, tears sliding down his cheeks. "Father," he whispered, "I'm here. It's Edmure." Hoster's eyes fluttered open. He stared at Edmure as if from a great distance. Then his lips moved. "Cat," he breathed. "I failed her." Edmure shook his head, tears falling. "No, father, you didn't. You always did your best for us, for the family." A faint, bitter smile curved Hoster's mouth. "Then you must do better than me." He exhaled a trembling breath. "Duty, family, honor." The words were barely audible. Edmure pressed his father's hand to his chest. "I will, father. I will remember." A final shuddering breath, and Hoster Tully was gone. The passing of the Lord of Riverrun echoed through the castle like a bell tolling. The next morning, the black banners were unfurled, and the river lords came to pay their respects, each with their own opinions about Edmure's choices. Lord Carol Vance, with tears in his eyes, apologized for doubting him. Lord Jonos Bracken reminded him that leadership required cold calculation. Others offered half-hearted condolences. By the ancient rites, they placed Hoster's body on a funeral boat, draped with Tully banners. In the tradition of the Riverlands, they lit the boat afire with a flaming arrow shot from Riverrun's walls. Edmure himself took the bow with trembling fingers, recalling the story of how Hoster had once done the same for his own father. Edmure missed twice, the arrow splashing into the water. On the third attempt, it caught the funeral boat, and flame curled across the cloth. He watched, heart heavy, as the current bore Hoster Tully away in a swirl of sparks and smoke. Fittingly, the Tully funeral took place in the presence of a divided realm. Edmure thought he could almost hear his father's voice, telling him to mend the rift, to restore House Tully's honor. After the ceremony, Edmure was officially recognized as Lord of Riverrun by the gathered bannermen. Some gave him warm embraces, others grudging acceptance, but he was now their lord, no matter the circumstances. Tension simmered just below the surface, for many blamed him for forging the Lannister alliance. Still, the day was consumed by funeral rites and quiet talk of the old lord's legacy. Edmure felt crushed under the weight of that legacy, knowing he had already broken from tradition in a way his father might never have approved. As the days passed, ravens brought word of more northern victories. Robb Stark had outmaneuvered Jaime Lannister, capturing him in a daring night assault. The Kingslayer was now a prisoner of the North, an astonishing coup that shook the Lannister hold on the war. Tywin Lannister's forces regrouped, calling in reinforcements from the Westerlands, but morale was shaken. Rumors suggested that Tywin was more dangerous than ever, determined to punish any who stood in his way. Edmure realized that Tywin might lash out at the Riverlands if he deemed them insufficiently loyal. With Jaime a captive, the entire shape of the conflict changed. Perhaps the Lannisters would need Edmure's neutrality more than before, or perhaps Tywin would suspect Edmure of conspiring with Robb to capture Jaime. In truth, Edmure had known nothing of Robb's plans, but suspicion would be enough to provoke Tywin's wrath. Against this backdrop, Walder Frey launched into negotiations with both sides. Edmure received letters from the twins, some praising the Tully Lannister pact, others hinting that Walder might join the Northern cause if the terms were right. It was infuriating, but Walder Frey's stance had always been ambiguous. No one in the Riverlands was truly surprised. Matters came to a head when Robb Stark's outriders clashed with a detachment of Lannister knights near the Red Fork. The Lannisters were traveling through Tully lands, allegedly with Edmure's blessing, when the Northmen ambushed them. A pitched skirmish followed, leaving several Lannister knights dead and the rest scattering. Tywin was incensed and demanded Edmure punish the Northmen's infiltration. Edmure insisted he had no authority over Robb's men, that the Tullys were not actively allied with the North. Tywin accused Edmure of duplicity, The uneasy alliance teetered on the brink of collapse. Lord Tywin then took a drastic step. He marched his main army deeper into the Riverlands, ignoring Edmure's express demands not to quarter men in local villages without permission. Town after town found themselves hosts to Lannister soldiers, who mostly paid for their supplies, but not always. Accusations of looting and forced billeting began to arise. Edmure sent outraged letters to Tywin, demanding redress. Tywin's replies were curt, pointing out that it was Edmure's failure to maintain control that forced him to protect Lannister interests in the region. It was clear Tywin no longer trusted House Tully to honor the letter of their agreement. Then came the final straw. A rumor reached Edmure that Tywin Lannister was pressing Walder Frey to betroth one of his granddaughters or nieces to a prominent Lannister cousin, effectively binding the twins to the Lannisters. If that arrangement went through, the North might be cut off entirely from southern routes, and Tywin would have a secure supply line behind him. The Riverlands would be overshadowed by Frey Lannister cooperation. Edmure seethed. The walls were closing in. The alliance he had forged was crumbling in spirit, if not in name. He was pinned between Tywin's demands and Robb's wrath. And all the while, the small folk suffered. One crisp morning, as Edmure brooded in Riverrun Solar, a raven arrived bearing a simple message from Robb Stark. He was offering terms to Tywin Lannister for Jaime's release. In exchange, the Lannisters were to acknowledge the independence of the North and withdraw entirely from the Riverlands. The letter was not addressed to Edmure but found its way to him through channels. It read like a pointed reminder that Robb was the one holding Tywin's heir. Edmure read it, heart pounding. If Tywin refused those terms, Robb might well break the Lannisters in open battle, or so the North believed. And where would that leave House Tully? Duty, family, honor? Edmure murmured, staring out the window at the swirling waters. He could almost feel his father's presence, urging him to atone, to remember the meaning of those words. Yes, he had sworn to protect the Riverlands, but House Tully was not built on craven deals. He thought of Catelyn, a widow. He thought of how Ned's death was a direct result of Joffrey's cruelty and Tywin's indifference. He thought of how Tywin had continued to ravage certain parts of the Riverlands despite their treaty. His people were growing restless, and he could sense that if he continued to stand by the Lannisters, there might be a lordly revolt within the Riverlands themselves. Still, the fear of Tywin's retribution loomed. If House Tully turned on him now, would Tywin bring fire and sword to Riverrun? Yet perhaps, with Jaime in Robb's custody, Tywin's hand was forced. If Edmure joined the North, maybe the combined might of the Riverlords and Northerners could hold off Tywin. Or perhaps not. The war was uncertain. The only certainty was that Edmure's attempt to walk a middle path had satisfied no one. He clenched his fists, recalling the sight of Ned Stark's severed head on a spike, an image from rumor, but vivid enough in his mind. Enough, he thought. Enough half measures. The North was family. Tywin was the interloper who had brought destruction and false promises to the Riverlands. With Jaime in captivity, the advantage might be with the North for once. His heart thumped wildly as he made his decision. He summoned Ser Desmond and the leading lords who were currently in Riverrun. He stood before them in the great hall, the Tully banners draped behind him, the hush broken only by the crackle of torches. "My lords," he said, voice resonating with a newfound conviction. "I sought to spare the Riverlands by forging peace with the Lannisters. That peace is broken. Tywin Lannister does not honor the terms. Our fields are still trampled, our goods taken, our people threatened. Meanwhile, the Stark cause, my family, resists tyranny. And we Tullys must remember who we are. We are not lion lapdogs." Some startled murmurs rose. Edmure pressed on. "I say we stand with the North against the Lannisters. I say we join the young wolf to drive these invaders from our lands. Let us reclaim the Riverlands' honor." There was a collective pause. Then, slowly, Lord Carol Vance rose to his feet, tears glistening in his eyes. "I, my lord, I have waited for this day. My men and I stand with you." Ser Desmond's face broke into a fierce smile. "As do I, my lord. For House Tully, for Lady Catelyn, for the memory of Lord Hoster." Some of the other lords exchanged uncertain glances, but the majority voiced support. Lord Jonos Bracken, still ever the pragmatist, cleared his throat. "We might all die for this, Edmure." Edmure nodded. "Perhaps, but better to die fighting for our own lands and for our family than to live on our knees at Tywin Lannister's pleasure." A cheer went up. In that moment, Edmure felt the heavy weight of self-loathing lift, replaced by grim resolve. He ordered Ravens dispatched to Robb Stark's camp, offering full support from Riverrun if Robb would accept them back into the Northern cause. He wrote an emotional personal letter to Catelyn, expressing his regret and begging her forgiveness. And he prepared the fortress for war. The news spread like wildfire. Edmure Tully had broken with the crown and thrown in his lot with the new king in the north. A dozen river lords who had kept their forces in uneasy neutrality rallied. Robb Stark, upon receiving Edmure's offer, sent back a curt but appreciative reply. House Tully would be welcomed if they proved their loyalty on the field. Tywin Lannister, upon hearing of the betrayal, was said to have flown into a rage in the halls of Harrenhal, swearing vengeance on the Tullys. The War of the Five Kings, already chaotic, gained a new dimension. And so, the Riverlands, once balanced precariously between lion and wolf, became a battleground once again, but this time with Edmure Tully fighting alongside his sister's son. The cost in blood would be great. Whole villages might be lost, and the final outcome uncertain. Yet, for the first time since the war began, Edmure felt a measure of clarity. He would fight for family, for duty, for honor. In so doing, he could only hope to cleanse the stain of his earlier bargain with the lions, forging a new future for the trout amid the swirling waters of war, where loyalty and treachery ran side by side like twin currents in a raging river. If the Riverlands must bleed, they would bleed with their heads held high, free from the lion's cage, allied to the wolves once more. And whatever the final toll, Edmure vowed to stand by his beliefs, no longer a pawn in Tywin Lannister's grand game, but a lord of the Riverlands in truth, come what may.